pattern. Now, one can question if there are other factors too, even in that, but essentially, if you can see this relationship in very short time frames, you might be able to establish that. The second one becomes a little bit more difficult, perhaps. Stochasticity starts coming in, and the last one, it is extremely difficult. We have all these papers, including this paper, that says I'm going to disentangle corrupt versus true causal effects, and whenever you see true in my paper, it has the apostrophe. True, really, So we try to do better. That's the point. Okay. So I wanted to give an example that I've given plenty of times in my class, and I think it really is a good idea of what I mean by cause effect. So consider cohabiting and divorce. This was actually a news article that was published maybe about 10 years back, and one of the only news articles that I read and thought, okay, this has some real content, as opposed to sensationalism, okay, necessarily. So the point was, the data came from a pool of divorces, okay, and the data showed that in the pool of divorces, there was a much higher fraction of people who had cohabited, that is, who had stayed together unmarried before that arrangement translated into an actual marriage. They also had a control group, which is to say people who had not divorced at all. Okay? And they looked even in that with the same cohabitation versus non-cohabitation. And the way the data showed, if you just do a statistical analysis, okay, what they found is that if you cohabited, the association was quite high likely, or rather cohabitation had a very positive correspondence with divorce. So the question from a policy standpoint, now I'm not suggesting that society should want to have fewer divorces, but if that were the goal for whatever reason, okay, if you look at that statistical result, the implication would be have an information campaign, blast out, don't cohabitate. Okay? Don't do it because if you want the marriage to be successful, you're not a good candidate. And then this journalist, reporter, was smart enough to ask the question, but is this really true? Okay. And so the hypothesis that I think it was he or she, I don't know, posited was that, look, who are the ones who might cohabit even before any kind of marriage? In those days, 10, 15 years back, seems like a long time back, but I think it was less common to have a cohabitation kind of arrangement. Today, it's part and parcel of our society. Okay, perhaps so. Okay. No judgments here, right? But it's possible that the ones who cohabitate are the ones who are very progressive, liberal. Progressive is not a right word, I don't know, so don't come at me. But they're okay with it. Okay, they don't. While people who have, based on faith, based on religion, based on whatever else, this notion that no, this is a sacred institution. Okay, I go into it once, and hopefully that's it. They are the ones who are not going to cohabitate, and they are the ones who are not going to divorce at any time. Okay. So the question was, you know what? If I want to reduce divorces, should I really be blasting and saying, don't cohabitate? And the answer is, if this hypothesis were true, probably not. Okay. So how do we model it? In a very simple fashion, the model would be the propensity to cohabitate. I have it as a function of xi and epsilon I, and there's a traditional binary choice model. Okay. And then I have the propensity to divorce. I have gamma dash Zi, Xi and Zi might have common elements, plus theta Ci, that is the cohabitation, whether the person cohabited or not, as a variable, plus eta I. Okay. So the point is, if I do not consider that these two error terms are correlated, okay, why would those error terms be correlated? Potentially because people who are very religious, perhaps, people who have some very strong notions of what is a marriage, okay, they might not get into a cohabiting arrangement in the first place, and they're not likely to divorce anyway. And I don't observe that. So the idea is, if I can capture that covariance, then the remaining effect of cohabitation should give me the true effect of what actually cohabitation did in terms of a divorce. Okay. So this is a modeling mechanism. Now, again I said, one can question, because we are putting assumptions all over the place. We are saying you have error terms. We are coming up with, should it be multivariate, normal, all of those things. Yes. Okay. But at least trying to say, I'm trying to disentangle it. Okay. So this similar kind of a thing over here. Except at a broader scale. I don't know how many of you can see it, but what we have is, we have some latent variable vector. And in this paper, questions can be posed here. We a priori decided that there are two latent variables. Okay? One is green lifestyle propensity, another is luxury lifestyle propensity. The idea is, these are intrinsic lifestyle-oriented values that do impact whether I stay in a high-density neighborhood, whether I own more or fewer cars, whether I pursue a lot of recreation or not, or what types of activities. Okay? I'll talk a little bit more about these two latent constructs later on. But so I have these latent constructs, and I have them stochastic because they are latent constructs, and still across individuals, even after I relate these to certain observed factors, there could be some error in that. So the latent variable constructs then, they essentially, through other latent dependent variable constructs, appropriate to our observed outcomes, impact these observed outcomes. That is the commute distance, the ordinal outcomes. In this case, the ordinal outcomes were indicators of preferences, attitudes. For example, my current home, I decided on the residential location based on proximity to my workplace. And it was a 5 Likert scale, from very important to unimportant or whatever. Okay. So we had some ordinal outcomes there. And then we had the count outcome, auto ownership, residential location in density categories, and the time use in during the day. So they were all tied together. But the bottom line assumption is that the jointness comes from these two. Okay. Now, you could think about this as a structural equations model, okay, with the addition of a multiple discrete continuous with some changes. Of course, in the estimation process is very different. So basically, what is done in a structure, and by the way, a whole bunch of identification considerations. Okay. I have that in my paper from last year. Just so many identification issues have to be considered in these kinds of models. But what we are doing here is, in some earlier studies without the MDC and not many of the nominal variables, there will be an exploratory factor analysis, okay, where you go from your indicators, okay, somehow do principal components, factor analysis, various methods to come up with a small set of latent constructs. That's in the first step. And then you proceed like the way we are proceeding here, okay, where you have what is called a confirmatory factor analysis, where these affect the indicators. You determine the loadings, okay. with covariates also included. Okay. So here, the main point is, we just a priori decided these are two. Okay. And the reason is, when you look at the exploratory factor analysis literature, you need a whole amount of data to determine what your factors are. And you can come up with 3 factors, 4 factors. How many factors do you want to have? There is no clear guidance. And the power to identify the number of factors, it's really, with the sample sizes that we typically have, it tends not to be adequate. Okay? And in our case, we don't have a battery of hundreds of questions on these ordinal indicators. We have only 7, 8 kinds of questions. Okay? So I'm a strong proponent of, I don't need to know everything through only data science, okay, factor analysis, etc. I'm okay with, when you look at the explanations for a lot of the jointness between residential location and auto ownership, they'll go back to those 2 factors. Okay? So we went back into the literature. Her Highness, as I like to call Pat Mokhtarian, has done some research in this area and has identified through factor analysis and whatever, that there are certain fundamental underlying constructs that impact residential choice, that impact mode choice, auto ownership, etc., etc. So in the paper, what we did was we looked at the literature, we looked at what are the constructs that have been identified, okay, through perhaps much more extensive investigation than we are doing here. And basically, the argument was, look at the factors for various different dimensions in isolation. They really basically are these 2 factors. Okay. So, plunge into that from the beginning. I don't have any exploratory factor analysis. Okay. Okay. So, I'm going to go forward more toward the empirical results here. The notations are quite intensive. The MDC model, once again, I had an opportunity to discuss some of it in a class earlier, so I'm not going to talk about that. So we have, let's look at an application. Okay? By the way, the paper is at my website, and all the papers and references are also at my website for the econometric details. So what we did was, from an empirical standpoint, we looked at those 4 variables from a Puget Sound region, and we had a good, reasonable sample size of about 36, 37 individuals, and these are households in which there's at least 1 worker, because we are focusing on commute distance as one of the outcomes. And these are some of the attitudinal questions. As you can see, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, only 6 attitudinal questions. And it's interesting to see that distance to work and having a walkable neighborhood and being near to local activities were 2 of the most important considerations in choosing where the person is currently living, the household is currently living. You'll see quality of schools doesn't seem to be very important here, okay? But obviously, when you stratify the sample with kids and without kids, you see a huge difference. Okay? And we are able to accommodate for that. Okay? That's not an issue because we have covariates in our preference points. I won't go through some of these details. The dependent variable, one of them is the MDC variable. Obviously, everyone participates in in-home activities. Okay? And when you look at this during a work day, you'll find quite a few people participate in shopping and personal business and not that much in others. But most importantly, you'll see that there is clearly multiple discrete continuous participation. That is to say, there are only 14.7% who participate only in in-home, 85.3 participate in in-home plus at least 1 out of home. And when I'm saying out of home here, work is not considered out of home because that's all. I'm saying work, all of those things have only been treated up. Okay, work-related ones. And what you'll also notice is that for personal business, we have 13.4, which essentially means 13.4% of households participated in in-home and only personal business as out of home. Okay? While a majority of those who participated in personal business participated, of course, in in-home, because everyone participates in in-home, but at least one additional out of home. So this is a classic case of multiple discreteness as opposed to single discreteness. I've already mentioned this to you. We had GLP and LLP, as we call it, green lifestyle propensity and luxury lifestyle propensity. And you know, the effects fell out the way you would expect in terms of people with a high green lifestyle propensity, tending to be closer to workplace, tending to have fewer autos, in walkable neighborhoods, etc. So, in quite, you know, what you would expect. We also found, when you look at a covariate, some interesting impacts. Lower income households have a higher green lifestyle propensity related to higher income households. Now, in the environmental psychology literature, for a long time, the general thinking was higher income households tend to be more green. And the reason is, going back into Maslow's theory of, you know, the hierarchical needs, the basic idea is, as humans, we are first going to want to take care of our immediate biological needs, food, housing, clothing, etc. And only after satisfying those do we consider the higher level needs, for example, environmental quality. So from that standpoint, higher income households should be more green because, you know, they have the wherewithal, financially speaking, of being able to consider the non-essential needs, so to say. Now, interestingly, the latest turn in that literature is perhaps not. Okay? Perhaps lower income households are more green, and the debate over that, or the discussion over that, or the support, if you will, for that is, for a long time in this country, low income neighborhoods, minority neighborhoods have been the place that has served as, if you will, for a lack of a better word, the dumping ground for all kinds of waste. And because of that, the people living in those neighborhoods have seen firsthand the problems created by these kinds of things, by environmental quality problems, and so they have become much more sensitized. Okay? So it's an interesting argument. Young adults have a higher GLP related to those with a low fraction of high fraction of young adults have a higher GLP. So younger, more green. That we have seen in many other cases too, and quite intuitive. More exposure to environmental issues, perhaps. Once again, for a lack of a better word, perhaps more liberal, more progressive in thinking. Now, the last one, higher GLP, women in general tend to be much more green than men. There are some really interesting debates in the social psychology literature about these issues. And many papers actually seem to show proof that, stereotypical maybe, but women, the differences between men and women here is because of, at least according to these papers, is because of differences in socialization norms and relational values. From a socialization norm perspective, women apparently are much more cooperative and interdependent, while men tend to be independent and competitive. Okay? From a relational value, women tend to be more sensitive to the needs of others relative to men. And when you put both of these together, women tend to be more sensitive to what they should do to improve the environment quality for the benefit of all, more altruism. Okay? So, interesting, some of these results. And luxury lifestyle propensity, not very surprising, increases with the number of children in the household. So we thought about it. Of course, what's the point in having all these results without having some story, right? So we looked at the literature, and it's fascinating how much some of these things are being studied in other fields. So in the dramaturgical literature, okay, apparently the mother is the main actress. In a drama, she plays to society about privileged motherhood. Okay? And so before she gets to that stage of motherhood, the idea is opulence, right? A show of opulence, a show of uniqueness in space, okay, becomes staging matter for this main actor and her supporting cast to project to society what they have come to expect as good, privileged motherhood, which translates to this show of opulence and this show of uniqueness in space. So, interesting if you look at the dramaturgical literature of how this is viewed and how the whole idea of motherhood, the picket fence, whatever we want to call it, is looked at. Okay. Let me go to previous. So the question is, okay, fine, all well and good. So is there anything out of this? So what we did was, we came up with what is referred to as the average